Howdy, folks, and welcome to Moose Podcast 289. Wow, what an exciting week. So many cool things going on. Seem to really energize you folks. Not only you guys listening, which I'm really grateful for, but you guys have been spending time reaching out to me with some really great questions. And I love all the love notes. And basically just support for the Moose Podcast. So thanks ever so much. Also want to thank my good friends at Bedford's Camera, bedfords.com, for supporting the Moose Podcast. And all of us, the photographic community. Great inventory, great prices, great information, great resource. And they're really working on helping us move that ball forward with all their education they're doing online and in person, like PhotoCon that's coming up, I'll be part of. So make sure whether you're on the phone, you're on the web, or in person, tell them thanks for sponsoring the Moose Podcast and drop my name. It's going to save you some real money, that Moose discount. So thank you, Bedfords, bedfords.com. Want to jump into this week's episode, AF Challenged. I think it comes in part from the firmware drop for the Z9, the Z6 II, and the Z7 II, but I think it also comes from just the general photographic process and using autofocus. It really stems from an email and some really great questions from Rich. So thank you, Rich, for reaching out, and I appreciate the questions. But let me get to this one part. It says, "Hey Moose, I've been shooting since the D100, and now I'm using the Z6 II. Really love that camera. Love all the options, and I love the autofocus speed. But he said, here's my problem. My keeper rate, it seems from the D100 to the Z6 II, hasn't really changed. It has not improved. I feel really AF challenged. Can you help?" Well, Rich, I think I can help in a general sort of way. If I was standing right next to you or shooting, I could probably be more of assistance. But from what you said in your email, and again, thank you, it was a great email, and just saying AF challenge, just summing up that way, I think I've got some direction which to give you. I'm going to start off with the very first premise that a lot of photographers seem to have. I'm not saying you have it, Rich, but it just seems, I'm going to generalize. A lot of photographers think that their keeper rate, their number of images that they keep because they're sharp, is based on the camera body they have, the autofocus performance it delivers in conjunction with the lens. And that if by automatically buying a Z9 and loading it with firmware 2.0 and putting a Z7200 2.8 lens on there, that you're guaranteed sharp images. That is the premise that I'm afraid a lot of photographers go with, and it don't work that way. Just because you have the latest and greatest autofocus doesn't mean instantly your keeper rate is going to go up. That would be nice, but that's not the case. So autofocus, I should premise this by if you want a really great discussion on Nikon's autofocus, you need to watch Steve Basil's and Mark Cruz podcast. It's 90 minutes. It's great 90 minutes where Mark goes through the entire Z9 autofocus system, which in some extent applies to the Z6 II that you have, Rich, and other folks in other systems, but goes through the system and helps you understand what it can and cannot do, how to optimize it for your own photography. And that 90 minutes, I'm not going to try to duplicate here on my podcast, but it is a great discussion on autofocus. Now, autofocus is only going to be as good or deliver the keeper rate you want if you, the photographer, give it the platform to do its job the best, the fastest, the quickest, the surest. So it is only as good as we are. And I think that part of this whole system has been lost in the discussion. It's very important to understand that. What do I mean? Couple things. First, the camera, the actual camera, has to have a stable platform to deliver a sharp image. That means either A, your hand holding technique is dead on, or B, your long lens technique on a tripod is dead on. If those two, either one of them, you're not giving the stability to that system it needs, no matter what autofocus you have, no matter how good it is, you're not going to have that tack sharp image. There's no if and buts about it. And then you've got all these, sub factors to that. Your panning technique with your hand holding around a tripod. Your understanding of the motion of that subject and how shutter speed affects freezing or not freezing that motion. For example, if you're photographing something that's moving and you got a bicycle that's going zipping by you, you could get a tack sharp image of that bike moving even at a really slow shutter speed. Understanding that the bicyclist could be tack sharp, but his legs, which are pumping up and down, will be blurred no matter what if you're shooting a slow shutter speed because the motion is not parallel to the panning that you're doing. So the autofocus itself, what is the goal of autofocus systems in our cameras? It's to lock on to the subject. That's what they're to do. Autofocus is to move those elements in that lens so they deliver whatever you determine as the photographer, the sharp part of that subject you want is sharp on that film plane. That's the job of autofocus. It's not to increase your keeper rate. It can help in that process, but you first got to start with that stable platform. And then you've got to meet that autofocus a bit halfway. Even with the incredible ramping up of autofocus abilities the Z9 brings to the table now. Still got to understand that it needs contrast, strong vertical, diagonal line, horizontal line. Maybe not as much as the D6 or the D5 or the Z6, but those elements still make it just come to life faster. And understand that it needs f8 or faster lens, not this aperture you're selecting for your depth of focus, but the light coming through that lens barrel's got to be f8 or faster. And that's the starting points, folks. That's just the starting point. Because once you meet these criterias, then the autofocus can do its job. It can lock on and snap to that subject and bring it tack sharp to the viewfinder and deliver that in your image. Now, autofocus challenged. Rich, I kind of got the feeling that modes were part of your challenge, and I can understand that. And there is a ton of modes. And now with the Z9, with addition of the C1 and C2, which I just love so much in the D6, it brings more options. And I highly recommend you listen to Mark Cruz's definition and how you can make those work for different subjects to help you figure out which is the AF mode you need. And Nikon does put out for the D6 and the Z9, they do put out an autofocus guide that if they say, if you're shooting this, we recommend you start with this mode. And if you're shooting that, we recommend you start with this mode. And that's the key, start off with. So I'm going to talk about the AF modes I use and why to give you a place to start with. Understanding that I practice every day my hand holding technique and my long lens technique, and I am very, very acutely aware of subject motion and shutter speed and what it takes to stop that motion if that's the desire in the photograph to get the sharp image. So on those, I'm building with the AF mode in the camera. So I'm going to be talking about the Z9. That is the only camera I have in my bag. That is it anymore. Is the Z9. It the body just delivers. It rocks. And every time I go out and shoot with it, I shake my head and just say, thank you, engineers. You created a system that works with my logic and delivers and delivers and delivers. So I have 3 autofocus modes that I rely on and 1 manual mode. So the 3 autofocus modes I depend on. Number 1, the primary one I'm using the vast majority of the time is 3D with eye detection turned on, whether it be for people, critters, or mechanized. That is the primary one that I'm using. I'm going to say probably 75 or so percent of the time. The next one that I depend on is auto area AF. And a lot of you might say, well, that hasn't changed. It really hasn't, except for it's improved. And then lastly is dynamic wide. I have 3 autofocus modes then that I have programmed into my buttons that I can quickly access, and on the fly I can change as needed, and they cover 99.9% of my shooting now. And that last little 0.1%, yeah, that's manual focusing. It's vastly decreased as time has gone on. Now, let me start off with that 3D. Like I mentioned, Mark, he just does a marvelous job in that 90-minute podcast with Steve talking about the autofocus. So I'm not going to try to duplicate that. He did a great job. But one thing he made very clear and did a great job of and reminded me, and it's very important, is that the autofocus system, you could say, is a layered system. It starts with some basics, and then they layer more and more and more technology on that system to make it work. Now, I said my primary was the 3D eye detection. Now, the DSLRs, the 3D just never worked for me. And not until I listened to Mark did it all make kind of sense why. So in a DSLR, there's an actual AF module in the mirror box driving the autofocus system. Well, with mirrorless, there's no mirror box. So the autofocus is off the sensor. That's the first thing that's speeding up the AF process and then giving us more options and then basically giving us more layers in the autofocus mode to tailor the autofocus modes to our photography. So with that 3D, you have all those components like dynamic and lock on and tracking and color and all those things that are really important. And now they've given another layer, which is that eye detection. People, critters, and mechanized. You have all of those layers working in conjunction that with the input from us as photographers, it says, oh, there it is, and boom, lock on. Now, that one input that's really important, keep in mind that we're giving that camera a stable platform, okay, is that we move the AF sensor to what we want sharp. And then the camera will lock onto it. And with 3D, even if the subject moves or we move with the subject, it's going to keep that subject locked on, the lens focused at that point. And that's what the autofocus job is really about. Autofocus. The actual name sounds like, in our mind, we're going to say this is the subject, and without us doing anything, the camera can read our mind and go zoop and boom, lock on and deliver a sharp picture. We still have to do the mechanics with our body to make that all happen. So in 3D, whether I'm photographing a person or a critter or something mechanized, and I'm looking through that EVF, I'm going to hit the joystick. I'm going to move that box to that subject. I'm going to hit the AF on button on the back, which is back butt focusing. The camera's going to lock onto the subject, and as long as I keep that AF on button depressed, it's just going to hold focus no matter where it moves, how it moves, I move. It's going to keep it with that 3D. It just works. Whether I got a bird bouncing around in a bush, I got some critter, a mammal scurrying around on the ground, does a killer job. Again, I'm giving that camera that stable platform to make it sharp image. Next, I have that auto area AF. If I got something moving, a single thing, a plane in the sky, a bird in the sky, I'm going to use that. And make sure you go to my settings for the Z9 to understand all the settings that I'm using with my autofocus to tweak it to my photography. You're looking for those kind of results. Keeping in mind that stable platform. Auto area AF, when you've got a single item that's moving on the ground, like a single person running or bird flying, plane flying, taxiing, it just locks on. And the dynamic wide, I'm using that strictly when I've got something coming straight down the lens barrel. I mean, as if there is no camera there. If I stood there, it's going to end up running me over. The dynamic wide works the best. Now, with those three modes, are you guaranteed a sharp photograph? No. Because here's the last parameter to this that you need to remember. As we have increased our camera technology, and we'll go with Rich's D100 to Z6II scenario, we have changed the actual sensor in the cameras. And we've changed the pixel wells in those sensors. I'll try to explain this, people. This is the only analogy that I've come up with that kind of emphasizes the point. So as we've gotten more megapixels in our camera, the amount of slop available in your focusing, be it your handhold technique, a long lens technique, your panning, combination thereof, has gotten to be the tolerance level for that slop has gotten less and less. So what do I mean? Well, I'm exaggerating here, hard to believe. But let's say we're going to talk about an older camera. Let's say the D1, right? Let's start off at the very beginning of the D1. So the D1, if you had a wash basin and you're 6 feet above it and you're pouring water, you got to get water in that wash basin and contained in there to have a sharp picture. Now we zoom ahead in time to the Z9. That same picture at 6 feet away, we now have got to get that water all into a thimble in order to have a sharp picture. Because we now have less pixel space in which to fill to get a sharp picture. Hopefully that makes sense. In other words, with the greater megapixel count, the greater your technique has to be. The amount of slop has to be Zippo compared to you could get away with it with less pixel count. And that's really important part of this final scenario. If you want that tack sharp image, it's not the autofocus system that's going to make or break that. It's you, the craftsman behind it. The autofocus is just going to help you lock onto that subject, hold on to the subject so you can then perhaps concentrate more on your technique than you can the actual process. So AF challenged. I understand where you're coming from, Rich. Hope this helps. Understand it's a marriage between technology and photographer. You can make it work. Just have to think about it. Practice. I appreciate you guys dropping by. I trust you have a great week. And remember to make every click your story.